Edgar Allan Poe creates Gothic, romantic, and poetic elements to express feelings of separation and isolation. Edgar Allan Poe's use of separation in the beginning of the poem contrasts from his representation of isolation later in the poem. Although separation and isolation are very similar, they are quite different. Separation is the concept that the narrator is different and set apart from the rest of the population, while the concept of isolation is when the narrator feels left behind and is consumed by the darkness while the rest of the world lives in light.
Gothic elements contribute to the overall feeling of loneliness and sadness more so than the fewer romantic elements of nature. The general feeling of isolation and darkness is created throughout the poem through the narrator's use of Gothic elements. In the beginning of the poem, the narrator creates a feeling of separation by stating that he's felt different from others throughout his entire life. Secondly, at the end of the transition from the mood of separation to isolation, the narrator states, "From the red cliff of the mountain," which contributes to generating a feeling of separation and isolation. The mention of a cliff implies that the narrator has nowhere to go, since he is at the edge of a cliff, and, combined with the earlier mention of his upsetting memories from his past, implies that he's trapped in his memories with no way to escape them. These Gothic elements of isolation and separation contribute to creating the overall Gothic mood of the poem, more so than the fewer romantic elements. In the last 4 lines of the poem, the romantic elements of nature create a feeling of isolation and darkness, which contribute to the Gothic mood of isolation. However, since there are more Gothic elements contributing to the overall isolated and separated mood than romantic elements, the poem is more so Gothic than romantic.
The narrator expresses his feelings of separation in the beginning of the poem by using antithesis to contrast himself from others. The narrator separates himself and draws the differences from his childhood to other childhoods. He speaks about how he has not been similar to people since he was a child. When the narrator states, "As others were, I have not seen. As others saw, I could not bring," he is stating that he has not had the same experiences others have had, and he cannot see what others see because he has had a different past that has corrupted him. The structure of these phrases is repetitive to show the similarity in the pasts of others with the phrases "as others saw/were," and the negative connotation as I could not see, and could not bring. The contrast from the capability the author describes the others to have. Poe uses antithesis to contrast the narrator's incapabilities from the population's capabilities. This antithesis emphasizes the separation between the narrator and the rest of the population. Poe's word choice in these two phrases emphasizes how the author is hindered by his corrupted childhood, while others reap the benefits he does not have.
The narrator expresses his feeling of isolation in the conclusion of the poem through romantic elements of nature. The narrator mentions multiple aspects of nature ignoring him, with "the sun that round me rolled," and "the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by." These aspects of nature are very significant, with the sun often being considered the source of all life, and lightning being the source of violent and swift destruction. When the author states that the lightning passed him by, he implies that the lightning, which would typically be attracted to people, ignored him, and from this it is reasonable to assume that since the sun also did not touch him, the narrator is implying that the sun also ignored him. Romanticists often use momentous aspects of nature to exaggerate the feelings that they attempt to convey in their poems. Therefore, it is likely that the narrator used these romantic elements to express his dramatic sense of loneliness and separation by stating that he felt so alone that not even the sun or lightning would notice him.
The narrator's conflicted childhood has separated him from the population, making him feel isolated and depressed later in life. In the lines, "Then in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life was drawn," the narrator symbolizes a storm as previous conflicts and sorrows in his life. He describes his stormy life as the origin of the mystery which binds him still. The mystery is an element of Gothic poetry because it creates a level of eeriness and the element of the unknown. The author states that he does not know specifically why he is trapped by this past. However, he feels that he is binded by this separation from others. Poe uses the word mystery to emphasize the feeling of the unknown reason that he is constrained in his past. This separation or difference in early life translates to the isolation from others as an adult. The format of the poem also adds to this concept. In the beginning of the poem, the narrator speaks about the separation he feels from the general public as a child. Later in the poem transitions from the separation he felt as a child and to the isolation he now experiences as an adult because of his experiences as a child. Poe uses this chronological order to communicate this concept of the transformation from childhood to adulthood, from the separation to isolation transition. Poe then says that he could not bring his passions from a common spring. This supports the claim of the narrator's corrupted childhood because it shows that he does not draw what is most important from him from the same source or origin that others have, separating him from the rest of the world. His experiences as a child have changed him and separated him from the rest of the world as an adult.
The narrator expresses his depressed mood in the last 4 lines of the poem through the use of romantic elements and antithesis. The narrator wants to portray that the storm clouds are standing in the way of him seeing the light when he says, "From the thunder and the storm and the cloud that took the form." With these storm clouds blocking his happiness, he says that a demon is in his view. The narrator uses antithesis to show how different heaven and demon are. By using demon so closely to the word heaven, he is able to show that the path he is going down is very dark and that there is not much hope for him. The narrator touches on the concept of being trapped by his point of view, an element of Gothic poetry. Heaven has a positive connotation while demon has a negative connotation, which contrast from each other. Heaven contrasting from demon emphasizes the darkness the narrator feels compared to the happiness in the rest of the world. Everything good that comes with heaven he will not have. The sense that there is no hope for him to find the light is a Gothic element. After his description of his separated feelings, the narrator goes from showing that the narrator is different from others to showing that he is alone or isolated. The narrator contributes to the feeling of isolation by saying, "And all I loved alone." In this line he states that everything he loved didn't love him back. Everything that the narrator loved was not loved by anyone else. This statement contributes to the overall feeling of being alone. This statement is a very transparent and is an obvious statement that emphasizes the severity of his isolation. This is Gothic because the narrator is describing his separation and isolation he has felt throughout his childhood.
Edgar Allan Poe is able to communicate the feeling of both separation and isolation through Gothic, romantic, and poetic elements. Separation is the concept that the narrator is different, and isolation is the feeling of being alone or left behind. The Gothic elements contribute to the overall feeling of separation and isolation more so than the romantic elements of the poem. In the beginning of the poem, Poe uses antithesis to contrast himself from the rest of the world and describe himself as different because of his childhood. In the middle of the poem, Poe switches the focus from separation during childhood to isolation later in life. He uses figurative language to describe the past as a source of his isolation as an adult. The narrator uses elements of Gothic poetry to describe his feelings of being trapped in the past and express his feeling of isolation in the conclusion of the poem through romantic elements of nature. The narrator describes being ignored by important aspects of nature, which communicate his feelings that he is ignored by the rest of the world. The narrator expresses his depressed mood in the last 4 lines of the poem by saying that the storm clouds are blocking him from seeing the light. There is a use of Gothic elements to show that there is no sense of hope for him. The narrator shows both separation and isolation when he says, "And all I loved alone." This shows that he was truly alone all of his life.